All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are talking about the lack of surprises in the Falcons' first padded practice of training camp. We'll talk about the updates to Dion Jones' status with the Falcons, and hot take, we'll be talking about Deshaun Watson's suspension and why it doesn't make any sense to compare it to the suspension of Calvin Ridley.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at Falcfans, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. We thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, it's also free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. Give us a bell, hit that bell, give us a like. So, Falcons had their first padded practice on Monday. And basically, the biggest takeaway was it sounded like Grady Jarrett was whooping up on Elijah Wilkinson. The Falcons' new current option to start at left guard, which isn't necessarily a surprise, but sort of many of the takeaways from camp were that the defense sort of won the day. And so if you were a person that was already worried about the Falcons offensive line, then today's practice probably didn't necessarily alleviate your concerns. And for me, at least, I know I just sort of been like, look, I'm not worried about the Falcons offensive line because I already know that they're going to stink, and I've made peace with it. And, that peace comes by the name of Will Anderson or Jalen Carter at the top of next year's draft as a result of that. And so that's how I sleep at night. I don't know how the rest of you guys do, but you'll have to figure that out for yourselves. The other update we got on Monday was involving Bryan Edwards, who injured his shoulder on Saturday. We didn't really get a real prognosis on it, but he's basically day to day. So the hope is that he'll return sooner versus later. What was notable to me about, who sort of was seemingly getting more of those first string early reps with Edwards out of lineup seemed to be Damiere Byrd, sort of emerging as the third guy with Edwards already in that top three mix alongside Olamide Zaccheaus and Drake London. And so, one would assume then that, Byrd, Ozzie, Edwards, and London sort of are the top four guys. And that seems commiserate with what, you've been hearing on this podcast as the expectations heading in to training camp. And we'll see sort of how the rest of the wide receiver group sounds like they're kind of duking it out for one or two spots. I personally think they'll keep 5 wide receivers on the roster. I think, the fact that Cordero Patterson can kind of double as a wide receiver helps with that mark. I think the fact that Kyle Pitts and Anthony Firkser, or AKA, Swole Beasley, as we affectionately refer to Firkser on this podcast, are essentially big wide receivers as well. So you don't necessarily have to stack your roster with 6 wide receivers. You can just load up the practice squad and keep a bunch of guys there. Now, my opinion is that Cordero Hodge is the front runner to be that 5th wide receiver spot. And so far, it sounds like he's been having a good camp so far. I know Auden Tate has been a fan favorite in that regard for one of those wide receiver spots. And we'll just sort of have to see about him. From what I understand, he's had a solid camp, but hasn't necessarily shown out. For those of you that have missed the boat on, sort of my Auden Tate slander, and I'm only joking when I say that, I'm a fan of Auden Tate as a player. I just don't necessarily see him sticking on the roster in part due to not having quite the same special teams value as a player like Cordero Hodge has, and the fact that the Falcons already have 2 pretty capable X wide receivers in Drake London and Bryan Edwards that seem to fit a little bit better with what this team wants offensively than Tate does. But we'll see if, a prolonged absence from Bryan Edwards sort of allows a player like Auden Tate to emerge, but it doesn't sound like Edwards is going to be out for that much longer. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see how the rest of the week goes for the Falcons as they continue Training camp, we'll see if we can get some guests on to give their thoughts on what's going on in training camp. But, sort of my overall thoughts on today and the last couple of days of training camp is so far there haven't been that many surprises, right? Today wasn't a surprise, like, oh my God, the Falcons offensive line got, worked over in padded practice. Ooh, what a shock for us. The only real surprise is that, Elijah Wilkinson has kind of emerged as that front runner to be the left guard, and we'll see how if he can maintain that. There's been many a player that we're starting in the first 2 weeks of training camp that we're not starting by the end of training camp. So we'll see how that goes. But like for me, at least, I think if you've been listening to this podcast, and I know based off of the numbers that I was looking at in June and July, that not as many of you were listening and watching in those months. But if you've been, checking us out every single day, like I don't think there's too many major surprises as far as training camp goes, as it has gone in this first week, or less than a week in the first 5 days of practice so far. So we'll see what continues to develop, what changes over the next 5 days or so. And we'll talk about one relative surprise, at least based off of if you've been listening to this podcast regularly over the last couple of months, coming in the idea that Dion Jones isn't going anywhere. And we got that from Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, and we'll talk about that. We'll unpack that as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, people that know me, particularly those people that know me back in the day when I was going by the name of Pudge on the falcfans.com forums, RIP, they probably could conclude that based off of that nickname that, I was a big fan of cookies. I can take them things down by the sleeve. And that's not necessarily a healthy choice to make as I'm getting older. And the good folks at Built Bar are helping me make better, healthier choices because they now have these limited time flavors like the cookie dough chunk puff that gives me all the greatness of cookie dough that I want to enjoy, but makes it healthy for me because Built Bars are the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, but they're better than a candy bar because they're taste good and they're healthy for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber, and they come in a variety of flavors like the cookie dough chunk puff. I'm also a big fan of the coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, raspberry, salted caramel. There are so many flavors that you can try by heading over to built.com. Order yourself a mix box if you want to try them all. And when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So we got some news on Dion Jones's current status with the Falcons on Monday, according to Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, who tweeted out, the Falcons have failed in attempts to this point to trade Dion Jones, but have decided not to cut him, a source said. Believing he won't be a distraction to the team and salary cap savings are minimal, the team continues to monitor Jones's attitude and rehab from shoulder surgery. We'll probably have Jeff on at some point later this summer to give a little bit more clarification and context on what this means. But sort of my read on it is that, Dion Jones is going to be here for at least the time being. We'll see how that goes. Now, anybody who's, been listening to this podcast on a regular basis, basically since late May, has known that I've been pretty confident, pretty adamant, however you want to term it, that we've already seen that Dion Jones has played his last snap in Atlanta. And obviously this tweet seems to throw cold water on that notion. What's notable though to me is Jeff added some additional context and some follow-up tweets. He said, adding context to the Jones situation, the decision on whether to cut him has never been about money. He has $20.05 million cap hit if he plays, 18.98 if he's cut, far less if he's traded at 5.34 million. It has been more about his attitude and whether football ops wanted him around others. Jones's future with the team certainly remains tenuous and spins off a few things: his effectiveness, work ethic, and whether trade market shifts because of injuries on other teams. So, basically, I think the last update we gave about Dion Jones right before training camp started was the idea that he's expected to be here when camp kicks off. And, Jeff's sort of follow-up tweets seem to indicate that, it remains to be seen if he'll still be here by the time camp ends and final cuts are made, I believe, on August 30th or whatever that is. But for me, I sit here kind of being like, if he's not part of the future, then just move on from him. And that's not because I think Dion Jones is this bad player or this locker room cancer or anything like that. I think it's pretty easy argument to make that he's still the best linebacker on the team, at least the most talented linebacker on the team. And we'll sort of see, if the Falcons do decide to part ways with him. It doesn't sound like a trade is going to happen. Um, Jeff has been vocal in the past 18 months that basically the Falcons have been open, willing, whatever you want to call it, to trading Dion Jones since March of 2021. They haven't gotten any seemingly viable offers for him. And that's part of the reason why, despite believing that Dion Jones will not be a Falcon this year, I don't think a trade is likely to happen, and have not thought a trade was likely to happen. If it hasn't happened in the last 18 months, there's no reason to think it's going to happen in the next 18 days, so to speak. But we'll see. We'll see if something develops by the end of the month. We'll see if something doesn't develop, if maybe something develops by the trade deadline. Or maybe the Falcons will help facilitate a trade, as we've discussed previously, similar to how the Browns did with the Baker Mayfield situation, by eating some of Deion Jones's base salary, which I believe is like $9.6 million. So let's say $5 million, and they say, we'll eat $5 million of that, and you only have to absorb $4.6 million for a team trading for him. That will make that trade a much more palatable, much easier for other teams to pull the trigger on. So we'll see if that happens. And I say all this not because I want to sound like I'm bad mouthing Dion Jones. But to me, it's kind of clear, and Jeff seems to be implying this as well with these tweets, that like he's not one of their guys. Like when they talked about giving Jake Matthews that extension, giving Grady Jarrett that extension, they were like, he's one of our guys. They talked a big game about changing the culture. Terry Fontenot talked to the media Monday morning, talked about a lot about makeup and character and how that's the most important thing. And it's not because I think Dion Jones is a bad character guy. He's just not really a leader. And that's been something that, if you've been listening to this podcast since like 2018, we've been talking about. He's not the guy that's going to hold other guys accountable on defense. Like you want that middle linebacker, like you want that quarterback of the defense, the guy that's going to wear the green dot, call the defense, be in communication with the coaching staff, and communicate to his teammates. That's not really Dion Jones's thing. He's never been that guy. He's not going to be a guy that's going to hold other people accountable, because he's not necessarily accountable, because he's out here, kind of freelancing and doing his own thing. And that's fine when you have other players around him, being able to do the things that you want them to do, and allowing Dion Jones to be the playmaker that we know he's capable of being. We've seen, him over the first 4 years of his NFL career be this outstanding playmaker because of his coverage ability, because of his speed and his range, that he can make plays that other players can't make. And we saw that regularly over the first 4 years of his NFL career. We have not seen that on a regular basis over the final 2 years of his NFL career. And for me, I feel like it's time to move on. Again, not because Dion Jones can't be a productive player in this league, but he's clearly not part of the solution to this team. And certainly, keeping him around, hoping that a trade that hasn't developed in 18 months is going to develop in the next 6 months. I just think, just cut bait and move on, and move forward, and hope that Troy Anderson can be not only the coverage maven, the speed and range maven, but also have that sort of high character, and be more of that alpha, be more of that quarterback of the defense that you want moving forward. And so that, to me, is kind of the direction I guess I would like to see the Falcons going, and we'll see if they wind up moving in that direction. But sort of the last thing I'll say about it is, I'm not going to base, even despite Jeff saying this, like I see no reason to change my 53-man roster projection to include Dion Jones on it until we get a little bit more clarity on this issue. And I don't think necessarily these tweets provide that clarity, because basically, to me, what they say is like nothing is imminent. So he'll be here when he's healthy, and then we'll see. And I guess we'll sort of see. And we know that, the Falcons are known to say a certain thing and say, we love a guy, we want a guy here, and then change those plans a week or two later. And if you don't know what I'm referring to the whole situation with Matt Ryan and Deshaun Watson from, March. And that will sort of get us to what we'll talk about the rest of today's episode, and sort of my reaction to Deshaun Watson's suspension, my defense of the NFL in that regard, my not my confusion over when people compare Deshaun Watson's suspension to Calvin Ridley's, and we'll unpack all of that as we wrap up today's episode. I'm sure there will be zero controversy from those statements as we continue today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned. But we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen, but I always recommend your second listens. And why not make it the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows hosted by 4 people, giving you the lowdown on all the local sports as well as national sports. I'm sure Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste at ATL Day Ones, and John Chuckery from Hitting Hard, and Mark Zeno from A to Z will have different or similar opinions to me on this whole Deshaun Watson scenario, as well as Falcons training camp. So go check them out. Also on Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube. You can also check out the Locked On Braves postcast, and that will also be the home of the Locked On Falcons postcast, where Jarvis Davis and I will be breaking down every Falcons win and loss this season. Of course, Locked On Sports Atlanta, not only on YouTube, is free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you're currently checking out Locked On Falcons. So let's wrap up today with the most controversial statements, I'll say. And I know some people will hear what I say and think, oh, this is classic Aaron being contrarian. He's always doing that. And that's fine. And like, I want to make it clear, because what I'm about to say is not really a defense of Deshaun Watson, right? I want to make it clear that my opinion on Deshaun Watson is, I believe, in my opinion, that Deshaun Watson is a sexual predator, that he used his status to basically coerce women into, that were in vulnerable situations to do things. And we won't get too deep into the things that he was doing. And that, to me, makes him a sexual predator. I feel like Deshaun Watson was deserving of being suspended for more than 6 games. However, I don't feel like the criticism that the NFL as this larger entity has gotten in this regard is fair, right? Like, it wasn't really like Roger Goodell that was out here suspending Deshaun Watson. They wanted to suspend him for longer. But it was like Sue Robinson, a third party, a federal judge or whatever she is. No offense, the Honorable Sue Robinson, who decided on the 6-game suspension. We'll see if the NFL appeals it and decides to tack on more games. And we'll see how that plays out. It doesn't necessarily mean that, as I understand it, and I don't understand it all that well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, that suspension will automatically go through, because then Watson can sue, and then that will lead to the suspension being lifted. It's a whole legal issue. So we'll see how all that plays out. But, for me, I think a lot of reaction to Monday's news that Watson was only going to get 6 games, has led to a lot of criticism towards the NFL. And, I'm not necessarily wanting to die on the hill defending the NFL, because the NFL is kind of dumb in a lot of ways, if I can be frank about it. Like, particularly when it comes to making these rules, whether it's the personal conduct policy that Watson violated, whether it's, uniform policy and people having socks too high, whether it's their performance enhancing drug policy or their substance abuse drug policy when it comes to marijuana and weed and whatever the case may be. I think the NFL has a lot of bad and arbitrary rules, and it's silly to sit here and defend the NFL in that way. But I feel like just, attacking Roger Goodell for not giving, Deshaun Watson a long enough suspension, I don't know. That doesn't feel quite real. Like, if we're going to attack the NFL for anything, it's really less about Roger Goodell and the people that are deciding the discipline of Deshaun Watson, in my opinion, but it's really about the people in the NFL, these individuals in the NFL, the Jimmy Haslams, the Arthur Blanks, the Kevin Stefanskis, the Andrew Berrys, the Terry Fontenot, the Arthur Smiths, the Gail Bensons, the David Teppers, etc., that were willing to look the other way when it came to Deshaun Watson's transgressions. To basically look at, a potential sexual predator, an alleged sexual predator in Deshaun Watson, and be like, we're good. We're good on that. We're willing to make him the face of our franchise. And I think that's more an indictment of NFL culture. But at the same time, like, we could sit here, and again, I don't mean this as a whataboutism or anything like that, but we can certainly sit here and indict, our culture as a whole, or the failures of our justice system, our legal system, when it comes to sexual assault cases. And we talked about this with Daniel Lust back in March, about how, the legal system, it doesn't do a great job of treating these cases in the way that it did. I think it was a failure on their part. And I don't, basically, long story short is I don't know if it's quite fair to basically try to hold the NFL accountable for something that our legal system can't even quite do. And then you couple that with, let's imagine if Deshaun Watson had gotten that year-long suspension. I know Roger Goodell and the NFL were pushing for 12 plus games. Let's say that they would have gotten the year-long suspension for Deshaun Watson. Okay, he's suspended for a year. He loses $1 million, on his contract, and then he comes back next year with the Browns as the starting quarterback. Still got $229 million in guaranteed money over the next 4 or so years on his deal, and it's all back to normal. And so, like, this is part of it where, like, I feel like for years, and I remember telling this to my fellow Locked On hosts a couple of years ago when we were talking about them expanding the playoff format, and I kind of was just like, yeah, I think part of the business of doing this, of covering this league, is we often get into the cycle of, like, we complain about something the NFL did and then we just kind of move on. And I don't have a solution to that, of breaking that cycle. But, like, I don't know. I guess my solution is to be like, I guess I'll complain less about the NFL, and I don't think that's a good solution either. So, um, I don't know. I guess it just feels easier to me when I think it's easier to just sort of blame the NFL as this nebulous entity. And so, again, while I think Deshaun Watson certainly was deserving of more games, I don't know how you kind of resolve this exact issue. I don't think there was, basically what I'm trying to say is, I don't think there was a correct suspension that would have rectified the situation. We all would have been like, you know what, the NFL did this right. It's just kind of a no-win situation when it comes to stuff like this. And that's, we live in a society, part of that stuff, or whatever the case may be. Now, the other thing I wanted to add to this is about, Calvin Ridley. And, I see these two suspensions kind of juxtaposed often, particularly from Falcons fans as well as Falcons media, of, like, Calvin Ridley got a year for doing this, for gambling, and Deshaun Watson only got 6 games for doing what he's alleged to have done. And, like, I understand why people juxtapose those things, but I just feel like it's not they're not comparable. Like, they're two separate issues. They're two issues. Like, Ridley's suspension falls under this policy, the gambling policy. Watson's suspension falls under this other policy. Alvin Kamara's suspension will fall under, maybe, I guess, technically the personal conduct policy, but, DeAndre Hopkins' suspension falls under PEDs and whatever. They're all different policies. They've all been collectively bargained and whatnot. And so, like, trying to compare the two and being like, we should, I don't know if that's a winning way the NFL can handle it, by, like, we'll just have one policy for all things. And I think part of it is, like, the NFL has not really constructed the deal with, like, sexual assault in those things. Like, the NFL is perfectly constructed to deal with gambling and PEDs and how long your socks are. Like, that's what they're here to do. And particularly with Calvin Ridley, this is a rule that he violated. That's long-standing rule that people have known about for 60 years. We often talk about on this podcast how very few things are black and white, and there's shades of gray and whatnot. But, like, to me, this is one of the rare instances where it is very black and white, where Calvin Ridley broke a pretty obvious rule, that you can't break. And so I don't quite understand the whole, like, free Calvin Ridley movement that you see from Falcon fans. Like, I'll sit here and defend Calvin Ridley, the football player, all day long. It's part of the reason why I'm so critical of Arthur Smith, because I look at Arthur Smith and I'm like, how bad a coach are you if you couldn't figure out how to utilize one of the 15 best wide receivers in the business? But when it comes to Calvin Ridley and what he did, frankly, he's an idiot. He's a moron for doing what he did. And again, I get why people juxtapose those issues, because they look at what Calvin Ridley did, and say, oh, it's a victimless crime. And even then, it's not even, calling it a crime is not fair, because it's not even illegal. Like, you or I could have done what Calvin Ridley did and get on our phones and put money on the Falcons, and we wouldn't have gone to jail for that. And now you're sending Calvin Ridley away for a year. And meanwhile, what Deshaun Watson did on the opposite hand is the exact opposite of a victimless crime. And it was full, at least allegedly, had many victims, several victims, dozens of victims involved with that. And how how are those two things fair? I get why people juxtapose those things, but like, as I said, like this is what the NFL does, when it comes to Calvin Ridley stuff, right? And I just don't see how anybody could argue that like the NFL should have gone lighter on Calvin Ridley given those circumstances. Now, if you're arguing they should have gone harder on Deshaun Watson, I'm 100% with you, but why bring up Calvin Ridley? You know what I'm saying? Like Deshaun Watson's situation, to me, it's different. And so when people juxtapose those two things, I just don't think that's right. So that's kind of how I kind of feel on it. Again, I know that's a spicy take here. And again, I'm not trying to sit here and defend Deshaun Watson. But for me, to me, it was just kind of a no-win situation for the league. And we'll see how this thing continues to play out. But there was, as many people would sit here and be like, well, they should have banned him for life. Like, okay, like that's a perfectly valid opinion. And I want to sit here and say that other people's opinions on this are invalid or anything like that. But like, you knew that wasn't going to happen, right? Because then he would sue and it would be caught up in court cases for like 4 years. And all the while he'd be allowed to play football and collect a paycheck while he did that. So like that wasn't really a realistic outcome. So it was basically like sit him out for a year. And then, again, were we going to just sit here and be like, well, okay, well, he got his just desserts because he missed a year of football, lost $1 million, had to pay whatever he has to pay in settling all these civil suits against him. And then he just goes back to making millions of dollars playing for the Browns. And it's like, we're all good. That's kind of the larger point. I'm just saying, like, to me, it was just kind of a no-win situation for the NFL, and sort of we'll see how it continues to play out. It's not quite over, I guess. We'll see if the NFL appeals it and wants to tack on more games. We'll see how Deshaun Watson, if he decides to sue over that and do all those various things. So probably not the last time, we might have to talk about it on this podcast. So I am more than willing to hear what you guys think about that situation. I'm eager to hear your feedback. All I would say is like, if you disagree with everything I said, you're more than entitled to having a different opinion. I would just say, be respectful. We don't necessarily have to make this personal when it comes to this stuff. We can talk about this. And I'm also curious sort of where you guys at with Arthur Blank and Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot. I know a lot of Falcon fans, either refuse to believe that the Falcons were interested in Deshaun Watson. I know a lot of Falcon fans put it all on Arthur Blank or Rich McKay or whoever, and try to pretend that, Terry Fontenot and all those guys had nothing to do with it. I think that's kind of being naive. That's part of the reason why I tend to be a lot more cynical and skeptical about this regime, because I'm like, the same people that were willing to bet it all on Deshaun Watson are also the same people that you guys have confidence in or know what they're doing when it comes to rebuilding this franchise. And that's part of the reason why I just kind of sit here and like, okay, like, you do you. But yeah, obviously provide your feedback. Obviously I'm not necessarily comfortable talking about these things, which is why we don't talk about them that much, but I'm eager to hear what you guys have to say about it. You can provide your feedback by hitting me up via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on Locked On Falcons on the YouTube channel, or you can hit me up on social media, either at Facebook or on Twitter at Locked On Falcons as well. We'll be back, obviously, to talk more about Falcons training camp and less about this, but obviously, I've expressed my opinion. I'm more than willing to hear what you guys and gals have to say about this subject and tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why you kind of agree with me. Tell me why, whatever. I'm more than willing to hear that on this stuff. So that will do it for us, guys. Appreciate it. Make sure you check out Locked On NFL if you want to get more insight into what's going on around the league. I'm sure those guys will have something to say about the whole Deshaun Watson situation, as well as Locked On Browns. And I'm sure many other people have thoughts on it moving forward. So that is going to do it for us here, guys. Check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, etc. So appreciate it, guys. Till then.